Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur and we are in the 4th week of the course. We are talking about word processing, different aspects of meaning, different aspects of accessing the lexical form, that is lexical access, and in the last class we talked about ambiguity resolution and also a little bit about how lexical access might be based in the brain. Today's lecture will mostly talk about how you represent meaning in the brain, and it will go a little bit neuroscience-y in a bit, and I would appreciate if you remember some of these facts clearly. Now the question that we need to ask today is that how is meaning represented in the brain? In the last lecture we saw that knowledge related to the semantic knowledge related to the the meaning aspect of the concepts is being stored separately, whereas knowledge related to the word form is being stored separately. So it already tells us that yes, the meaning part related to words versus the word form is separately handled, and it is not only separately handled in terms of a cognitive model wherein we say till this point is lexical access and after this is meaning making. It is actually also separately handled in the brain. So that is what we got from the last lecture, from this whole section on neural bases of lexical access. Today we might zoom in a little bit more closely on the semantics part. So let us talk a little bit more closely about where is it and what different kinds of brain areas are involved in storing meaning in the brain. Okay, so this is what today's talk is going to be about. Now category specific semantic deficits, we talked about neuroimaging, neuropsychological approaches and people who have sorts of brain damage. So category specific semantic deficits have been shown. They have shown that when an individual has category specific semantic deficits, people could have difficulty understanding the meaning of some type of words, whereas others, whereas they will be fine with other kinds of words. So the idea is, I will give you an example. So people could have deficits related to tools, or they could have deficits related to natural kinds, or they could have deficits related to particular animal or people, and so on and so forth. So category specific semantic deficit basically means that your meaning system is fractured, but the fracture is only limited to one category. You are deficient in understanding the meaning, but that is only for one kind of categories. Okay, so in particular what has been shown is that there seems to be a distinction between the processing of words that refer to natural kinds, so animals, plants, people, foods, those kind of things, versus artificial or man-made concepts, say for example tools, buildings and other kinds of man-made objects. So there is this very interesting distinction that has been coming up with respect to when you look at patients having category specific semantic deficits. That is one. Also, the existence of this category specific semantic deficit has led to different kinds of theories in the neuropsychology and neuroscience literature. One of these theories basically argues or says that it might be that in the brain there are specialized locations, specific localized centers that store one particular kind of semantic representations. So the idea is that there could be separate semantic systems for separate kinds of separate categories of objects. Very broadly speaking, there could be centers in the brain that are only taking care of natural objects, things like animals, plants, people, foods, so many different things, and there could be separate centers in the brain that are taking care of these kind of things, say for example man-made artifacts like tools, buildings, houses, all of those kinds of things. So there probably can be a distinction between these two regions. Now these localization approaches, basically they say that semantic memory can be divided into separate categories, usually by natural selection. That probably has happened in a evolutionary sense, because those categories represent biologically important information. So for example, for our survival it might have been necessary to process the natural objects much more closely, in much more detail as compared to the artifacts that are man-made. And because of that, because of our interaction with the world, we have developed a system that okay, natural kinds are stored here and they are processed in some more detail, as compared to man-made kinds are stored in this part of the brain and are stored in whatever detail that is relevant to them. This conceptual division between the natural kinds and the artifacts is very interesting, and it could basically tell us that it could be reflected in the different physical organization in the brain. So, if a lesion strikes the area, suppose there is this particular area of the brain that gets damaged, and this region basically is more involved in representing the natural kinds of information. What would you expect? You would expect that all knowledge about natural kinds shall be affected because of the lesion in that particular area. Okay. So, in an individual with that kind of damage should not be able to comprehend or produce words relating to that entire category, whereas other concepts might be completely spared. Say for example, to put it very simply, there is this brain, this part stores natural kinds information, this part stores man-made kinds information. If lesion happens in this part, the entire knowledge about the natural kinds information goes away, while the entire knowledge about the artifacts and man-made kinds stays preserved. That is the argument that they are trying to make. Now, the localizationist approaches kind of are contrasted by other kinds of approaches, which are the distributed representations approaches, and the distributed representations approach basically says that concepts are represented as coordinated patterns of activity across a wide variety of brain regions. So, they say that it is highly improbable that one particular area in the brain is storing all of one kind of knowledge. What they say on the contrary is that any kind of knowledge for that matter is distributed across the brain, and so even if a brain lesion affects a particular area of the brain, it should not take up all kinds of knowledge with respect to that category, because the category in itself was stored across the different areas of the brain in a much more distributed fashion. So, there is this contrast between localizationist approaches and the distributed representations approach, and this is the contrast we will be looking into more closely as we move forward in this lecture. Now, this whole pattern, this whole concept of things being stored in a distributed fashion was very well taken up by Donald Hebb. He was a neuroscientist, and he believed that concepts consist of or concepts could be represented in a linked group of neurons. So, the idea is that there are groups of neurons that are tied together with excitatory connections, so that at any time any of the members of the group becomes active, all the members of the group will become active. You can kind of look at it as, say for example, there is this array of neurons A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and this array of neurons is storing one concept, let us say this pen. So, this array of neurons probably is coding for different features of the pen, and as soon as one of the feature gets activated by whatever way I mention the pen, or I move the pen across my visual field or whatever, this entire array of neurons will get activated. So, because this whole thing was stored in a very distributed fashion, even if I lose one or two neurons from this assembly, I would still retain the other kinds of information that are stored by the paired neurons. Okay, that is the idea, and this is basically some one of the principles that was involved in what was referred to as the Hebbian learning paradigm. Okay, so in this way, what happens is that a simple retrieval queue, something that could activate only one of or two of the array of that particular neurons, could help me remember that entire concept. So, for example, word could act as a retrieval queue that activates a sub assembly that represents the word's form, and then eventually, because of activity there, things linked to the conceptual and semantic information also starts becoming activated. These kinds of arrangement have been called as Hebbian cell assemblies. Now, you need to look at this idea a little bit more closely. So, what was done by Pulver-Muller, Pulver-Muller said that such assemblies form when different groups of neurons are active at the same time. So, if different groups of neurons are active when I am showing it the pen or the cell phone or chair or table, all of them at the same time are coding different aspects of this object. Because they are all at the same time coding different aspects of this particular object, they will basically sort of the way to say this is that neurons that fire together, they will get wired together, because they fired together with respect to this particular moving object in my visual field. They will get connected to each other by virtue of this common activity, and they will kind of get knitted together in sort of a network. Okay. And so for word learning, what could be happening is that when neurons respond to the sound of the word, and if the neurons responding to the sound of the word fire at some time, as the at the same time as other neurons that are responsible for coding things like color, shape, form, motion, and other kind of things, visual, tactile, all kinds of impressions, all of these things will get knitted in one pattern. That pattern is basically going to represent that particular object in all its entirety. So from the word form till the the form of the object, the color, whether it is moving or not, what is it used for, all of that information will then get coded into this Hebbian cell assembly, in this organization of this bunch of neurons. Now, once these associations are formed, once the brain kind of learns to represent concepts in such a distributed fashion, what you could do is you could access the sound when the perceptual and functional properties are activated, and the sound will appropriately activate the perceptual and functional representations associated with the name. So, as soon as you hear the name, everything related to that object kind of starts getting activated slowly at the same time. And the fundamental claim about this entire position is that word representations reflect naturally distributed groups of neurons that fire together when one subcomponent of the cell assembly becomes activated. Okay. So, this is the way this is being put up. Now, is there any evidence for such a distributed representation idea? So, there is apparently. First, suppose you consider that loss of, so one of the first sources of evidence comes from that if you look at more closely in this semantic category deficit, or category specific semantic deficit patients, what you find is that loss of knowledge of living things as one category example is more common than loss of knowledge for artificial kinds. So, what is more prevalent? If people would have lesion, there is a higher chance that they would lose some knowledge about the living things, natural kinds, versus they will lose knowledge about the man-made artifacts. Okay. So, that is one observation, and say for example, it has been seen that better preservation of knowledge about artificial kinds than natural kinds can be demonstrated in different kinds of tasks. Say for example, the confrontation naming task. Confrontation naming task is simply you kind of show the person a picture of that particular object or that particular natural kind, and you ask them to name, and you see that for some kind of objects they are more deficient as compared to some other kind of objects. That is the idea. That is how you will check it. Now, the localization separate position basically explains why knowledge of living and non-living things can differ, because they say that they are being stored separately, but it does not really explain why deficits occur primarily for living things more often than for non-living things. So, it says that okay, one kind of knowledge will be gone while the other will be preserved, but it does not really say why one kind of knowledge is more probable to go off as compared to the other kind of knowledge. That is what something that they do not really talk about. Now, the second observation is that the degradation of semantic knowledge about any of these categories is not all or none. It does not happen that entire knowledge is gone. So, some information about the impaired category has always been found to be preserved, and patients do better on some kinds of tasks that tap those features, and they do worse on some other kinds of tasks that tap the deficient features. So, depending upon how much detailed knowledge is required to do the task, independent of whether the task taps into the knowledge of natural concepts or man-made concepts, you can see differential patterns of deficiency. Okay. And so, there was this particular experiment Bright and colleagues did in 2006, and what they did was they wanted to test this out. So, they used a technique similar to Bates and colleagues, the Voxel based lesion symptom mapping technique. It is an fMRI kind of a scenario where you basically look at what lesion has led to what kind of symptom of deficit. Okay. So, they wanted to investigate the the relationship between conceptual knowledge, word processing, and the brain, and in the brain. So, they basically wanted to look at that. In this study, what they did was they had patients with brain damage perform different kinds of tasks that involve different kinds of words. So, there could be words of two kinds, natural kinds and artifacts, and there could be different kinds of tasks associated. And while the participant would be doing this task, the researchers would basically measure the neural response to different kinds of objects and different kinds of information processing that is happening. Let us look at it a bit more closely. patients with showed greater signal intensity in the anterior part of the temporal lobes, and they were doing better on tasks involving natural kinds. So, anterior part of temporal lobes is probably involved in dealing with the natural kinds, and when those tasks call for judgments about fine details. So, there are three things here. What is the task? The task is a judgment about fine details. So, things like do cats have whiskers, do dogs bark, do some things like this. So, you are accessing fine details of a particular kind. So, you are talking about fine details, you are talking about a particular category, natural kinds, and you are talking about the kind of task that is being done. So, all three you have to take into account. Questions that tapped on shared features, do cats have legs, do dogs have fur, those kind of things were not associated with greater signal intensity in the anterior temporal lobes. So, what is happening here? A particular region of the brain is showing more activity when a particular task is being asked to do for a particular category. So, that is what is happening. Now, if the knowledge of natural kinds were supported in general by a neural network in the anterior temporal lobes, which would be the localizationist position, both kinds of questions should have shown similar kinds of activity. So, even if I am asking the question about shared feature or I am asking a question about fine detailed feature, the same area should be activated if all the knowledge is stored here. That, however, was not the case. So, these results therefore are more compatible with the distributed account of semantic knowledge with increasingly complex features and combination of features being supported by more anterior regions, and with the dissociation between living and non-living categories being stored in a separate region. Okay. So, at least that much you can say. Now, moving on to a different kind of study, Thomas Grabowski and colleagues, they did this PET neuroimaging study, and the study involved two kinds of stimuli. This involved famous landmarks, Eiffel Tower and Arc de Triomphe, those kind of things, Gateway of India, those landmarks kind of things, and famous people. So, famous landmarks, famous people, and this is what they wanted to test. Now, according to the localizationist account, concepts from different categories should be represented in different regions of the brain and should be accessed by different kinds of neural systems. According to the localizationist account, what could you predict from here is that pictures of landmarks, so they had landmarks like the Washington Monument, Hubert Humphrey Metrodome, etc., should activate different regions of the brain as compared to pictures of famous people. So, that was the prediction. According to the perceptual function or the distributed approach, discriminating between landmarks and people both involve assessing fine grained details. Okay. So, it basically is not about the category, but it is about what kind of information you are trying to activate. Since both of them involve assessing fine grained detail in a particular task, so basically they should activate similar regions because the task is similar in in its approach, such as say for example regions like the temporal pole for that matter. What did they find? In Grabowski and colleagues' PET study, unique landmarks and famous people both activated the left temporal pole, and there were no differences found in the neural activity in any brain region with respect to whether you are responding to famous landmarks or you are responding to the famous people conditions. What does this tell us? It tells us something that the perceptual functional approach, or say for example the distributed approach, because that is basically a subset of this one, is fairly compatible. That is something that you could go more closely by as opposed to the localizationist approach for storing categories. So, that is something that you can say. Now, this perceptual function or the correlated features approach tells us something a little bit more in a bit more detail. And what does it say? It says that there could be different representational assumptions, and it basically kind of tries to explain the category specific semantic deficits in this particular way. So, what does it say? It says that correlated features, the semantic conceptual knowledge is represented in distributed neural networks, that is given. Because semantic representations are distributed, you cannot pinpoint a place in the brain and says this area is where the concept of cat, or this area is where the concept of natural categories is stored, whereas this other area is where the the information about man-made artifacts is stored. So, they say you cannot really distinguish between these two things, which is again the tenet of the distributed approach. And if you look at this more closely, first when you hear the word cat or think about cats, a wide variety of the brain regions would get activated, each of which may be representing different aspects of this concept cat. Okay, and this approach will be similar to what the Pulver-Muller was saying, or say for example, the whole concept of Hebbian cell assemblies. Secondly, what happens is a large distributed network of brain regions could be responsible for all of the semantic conceptual knowledge in that sense. And so what you could say from there is that knowledge about cats and all other natural kinds is stored and activated by the same distributed system that is representing knowledge for the man-made artifacts and other kind of categories as well. So, they are saying is that there is the same generic system, a distributed system that is storing information about all of these different kinds of categories. But if you have to say this, if knowledge about animals and tools is spread all over the brain, and if knowledge about cats is handled by the same system as knowledge about tools, why is it that we have sometimes a problem with the natural kinds and not the tools, or vice versa? Now, the answer basically to this question could be, from as far as this approach is concerned, lies lying in the structure of concepts themselves. So, the idea is some of these concepts, if you look at concepts, if you look at, say for example, when you are talking about the semantic networks theory earlier, basically could be that some of these concepts are made up of, I mean mostly concepts could be made up of different kinds of features. So, they could be distinctive features and they could be correlated features. So, in a particular category there could be features that are correlated with other members of the category or other members from outside the category as well, whereas certain particular features will be very distinctive, okay, that kind of establish the unique position of that specific concept. So, they every concept could have some distinguishing features versus some correlated features. Let us look at this more closely. So, correlated features, say for example, could be if you talk about animals, all of them, most of them, say for example, have 4 legs, they have 2 ears, they have a tail, etc. These are correlated features, but they could still have some distinguishing features as well. So, if you kind of look in more closely, there could be something some things very clearly, say for example, then distinguish from the cat from the dog. Say for example, the snout, the dog has a slightly elongated snout whereas the cat does not. So, that could be the distinguishing feature of these two concepts. Okay. So, you have to kind of look at concepts not in terms of broad categories, but in terms of what features are you going to talk about. Are you going to talk about correlated features which are common across the category, or are you going to talk about distinctive features that are unique to that particular concept? Living things, it has been found, have properties that tend to be highly correlated, as I was saying, 4 legs, tail, whiskers, ears, so on, and differences between different kinds of living things basically depend upon very minor differences in very specific attributes, the snout for example. By contrast, non-living things have highly uncorrelated properties, and basically knowing about one set of living non-living things does not really make you knowledgeable about all the other kinds of. So, for example, man-made objects are really very disparate. So, chair and table are still very similar, but chair and pen, or a chair and a camera and other things are actually very distinguished from each other. So, the idea is that living things have more correlated features than distinctive features, whereas non-living things have more distinctive features than correlated features. Now, patients with category specific semantic deficits have been found to have more trouble with properties that discriminate between concepts that have many correlated features. So, if concepts have many correlated features, category specific semantic deficit patients basically will have more trouble distinguishing between these particular concepts, and they have little trouble dealing with common features. So, shared features they do not really have a problem, but distinctive features they have a problem. Okay. So, for example, it could be that if someone has a specific deficit about animals and you ask them about the correlated features, they might still be performing as near to normal, but as soon as you start asking them about distinctive features of this category animals, that is where you will find that they will suffer. Okay. Neuroimaging data, moving on to some data, neuroimaging data from patients with category specific semantic deficit actually reinforce this idea, and it tells us that these deficits really stem from a general inability to deal with distinctive features rather than the entire category itself. So, they did this study, Peter and Bright study 2006, and they found they used fMRI to image the brain activity in patients with category specific semantic deficits. While they were being scanned, they answered questions either about both kinds of categories, so living objects and non-living objects. The non-living objects included vehicles, which are an interesting case because vehicles for that matter are very similar to living things because they also have very common characteristics. Say for example, all vehicles will have 4 wheels, they will have a visor in the front, they will probably have a steering wheel and so on. Okay. All sedans, say for example, and the differences between vehicles will be very idiosyncratic. So, sedans versus hatchbacks and so on, the difference is rather minute, I would say. Now, in this fMRI experiment, some of the questions were asked about shared features. So, does this have tires, does it have eyes, so on, and some of the questions were about distinctive properties. Does it have claws, does it have a peace symbol on the hood. So, again you see the two kinds of questions are being asked to both categories. The idea was to find out if the patients had trouble with the living versus non-living concepts, that is one whole category versus the other whole category, or one specific kind of question irrespective of the category. So, are they having problems with distinctive questions regardless of the category, or shared information regardless of the category, or no, they lose everything about one category but retain everything about the other category. That is what is being tested here. So, if instead the feature structure drives the subject's performance, then the patient should do worse on distinctive features questions than on shared feature questions regardless of what is the category in question. The fMRI results actually indicated that the patients who did better on distinctive feature questions had more activity in the temporal pole in the left hemisphere, and it was regardless of whether the questions were about non-living kinds or living kinds. This result in that sense is straightforwardly compatible with the concept structure hypothesis, which says that knowledge is not really organized by categories, but it is organized by correlated or distinctive features of across these categories. Also, that knowledge is stored in a much more distributed fashion across the brain as opposed to one particular site storing all the knowledge about a particular category. Moving on, this concept structure hypothesis also kind of tries to explain why category specific semantic deficits for living things are much more common than category specific semantic deficits for non-living things. And the explanation they give is that the trick to discriminating living things is mostly about by picking some of the highly specific discriminating features from a large number of highly correlated common features. So, distinctive features is something that is really needed if you have to kind of negotiate between different instances of the living categories. This is sort of heavy, this places greater burdens on this unified semantic processing system that handles both living and non-living objects, and that is why you would see that if a person has lesion, he would be more severely affected with the living things as compared to the non-living things. This is basically something that you can take away or conclude from here, and this will be all from me with respect to the chapter on word processing. Just to sum up, just to revise, what did we talk about? We talked about word being represented separately in terms of form and meaning, and then we talked a little bit about meaning, say for example sense, reference, introspection, semantic networks, association, embodied semantics. Then we kind of again sort of got into this whole concept of how lexical access is done. So, we talked a little bit about the lexical access in 3 different generations of models. We talked then a little bit about, say for example, how meaning could be stored, ambiguity resolution, how this lexical access is based neurally, word form information and concept information is being accessed from separate parts of the brain. And today's lecture we talked a little bit in more detail about how concepts or meaning can be stored in the brain in a distributed sort of a fashion as opposed to a localized sort of a fashion. That will be all for week 4. Thank you. In the next week we will talk mostly about sentence processing.